I just want to thank everybody for coming and thank the organizers and for setting up a wonderful conference here. I realize that there are probably half a dozen of you, if not more, who are going to absolutely hate this talk, but it is what it is. So I don't really like the title much, Toward a Formal Model of Free Will, but I couldn't think of anything better. So I'm just going to jump right into it. One of the motivations I have for what I want to talk about is this quote from philosopher Robert Nozick, which is that an action's being non-determined is not sufficient for it to be free. It might just be a random act. So we have a tendency to think of free will in terms of determinism versus randomness. And my feeling is that it lies somewhere in the middle of these two. And there are a lot of people who think that free will is related to randomness, but I think there is a fundamental difference between randomness and actual free will. But anyway, so what's the essence of free will? Because I want to emphasize, and the person who I thought would be most critical of this has left the room. So that was probably planned. I'm not taking a stance on whether free will is something that exists or not. I am actually taking a behavioral approach. For all I know, I could wake up tomorrow and find out I'm a Mongolian goat herder. I can't disprove that. There's nothing I can do that proves to you right here and now that I'm not a Mongolian goat herder. I can't prove it to myself. But that doesn't get me forward. That doesn't get me moving. In the here and now, I'm here talking to you, and I have to actually behave like I'm talking to you. So whether or not free will actually exists, we behave as if it does. So what is the essence of this behavioral thing of free will here? The essence is that, and I've thought long and hard about this. When you go to your refrigerator and you open it up and you decide that you want something, you've got carrots versus peppers, say. You say, well, do I want carrots or do I want peppers? A couple of things have to happen for you to have a free choice. But one of the more important things that often gets overlooked is that when let's say I choose carrots, okay? So I make the choice in my head that I want carrots. I reach in and I grab the carrots, or grab a carrot or something out of a bag, and I pull it out, and then I start munching on carrots. From the time I make the choice to the time that I start eating the carrots, a very important thing happens, and that is nothing. I rely on the fact that that carrot is still a carrot when I put it in my mouth, right? It doesn't spontaneously turn into a potato. We take this for granted, but it's very important. When I make a choice, I rely on the fact that my choice will lead to its actual outcome the vast majority of the time. Because if it didn't, if every time I went to the refrigerator and I said, well, I want carrots, and it's a potato. Well, I want peppers. Oh, it's a piece of chicken. I would eventually just throw up my hands and say, screw it. I'm just going to stop making decisions. This isn't free will. This is just random crap. So there's this important aspect of making the decision that the outcome of what we choose has to come true the vast majority of the time. Every once in a while you make a choice and something, it doesn't work out that way. But the key point is that there are the actual process, once you've made a choice, the process of carrying out your choice is very nearly deterministic, right? So while there is some randomness involved, once you've made that choice, the act of carrying out that choice is nearly deterministic. Okay, so there are expectations that we have associated with what we consider free will, and they include the following. So I just talked about this. The agent making the choice must have a high degree of confidence that the choice is going to be realized, because otherwise the agent's just going to say, screw it, I'm not going to make any more choices. It's not really free. The other thing is, though, if I had an infinite refrigerator, boy, that would be really hard to make decisions, because it would take me an infinite amount of time to process everything that was in that infinite refrigerator. And boy, that's just a waste of time. So we have to also have the confidence that, or have the ability to read into our memory all the possible choices and then process them in a finite amount of time. We can't, we have to have the, and this is why this is related to consciousness. We have to have the ability to read all the possible choices into our memory and make some judgments about them, because it's in the judgments that our choices are meaningful. They become meaningful in the judgments that we assign to the various possible choices. So a choice can only really be said to be free if the agent can make these judgments about these choices, right? We have to be able to judge one against the other. Otherwise, the choice is completely random. And I have to acknowledge my son, who's 18, and he was the one who really forced me to think about that last point. He kept saying, I gave this presentation, or a slightly different one, about a month and a half ago, and he happened to be there, and he kept needling me. He said, Dad, you really got to talk about meaning. You really got to talk about meaning. If you're doing free will, it's all about meaning. And he's right. I think he really nailed it. The choice can really only be free if we can make judgments about the possible choices that we have and weigh them against one another, right? Again, if we don't, it's just random. We're just throwing darts at the wall, and that's not a free choice either. What I suggest is that, and you'll notice that the first 3 bullet points are all about individual choices. I didn't talk about free will. I was talking about individual choices. Now, it's entirely possible that you could have some choices are free, some choices are not free. If I'm on as someone pointed out to me at the last time I gave this talk, if you're on an airplane and you don't have the choice of stepping outside for a cigarette, right? You just don't have that choice. It's not there. So some choices are just not free. And there's nothing wrong with that. So what is free will? Well, free will is sort of a statistical thing that arises from having a certain percentage of choices that are sufficiently free. Okay, so free will is this sort of emergent property, I'll say. So a couple of definitions just to get started, because this is a mathematical model of free will. I define a state to be a unique vector configuration of the fundamental components of a system as specified by some variable or set of variables, lambda. And so I had a student the other day complain about the use of Greek letters, and he's like, why can't we just use Latin letters? And I'm like, because we have too many things to name and we don't have enough letters, so deal with it. So for now, I'm gonna call this psi, and it's a unique vector configuration. It's a bold psi. It doesn't really look bold, but it's bold. And my choice of psi is not an accident. I am a quantum physicist. I'm not suggesting that there's anything quantum in my model yet, but it wasn't an accident. I purposely chose that just because, well, we'll see where this model goes eventually and what happens, and maybe I'll get to that point. So I'm just going to call it psi. A process is, and I label a process pi, is a means by which a system can transition between some fixed state I and one and only one of n possible states j. So I'm here, I'm in a state, the next instant of time I'm in another state, and there's been some transition. And if I'm presented with several possible choices, I may not be, but suppose I'm presented with several possible choices, I I can only transition to one of those choices. At least that's the assumption I'm making. Of course, quantum mechanics has some funny things to say about that, but we're not going to go there right now. So this is how I define a process. These two things, states and processes, and it's really about the processes. And too bad Bob Cook is not here at the moment, because Bob would emphasize the fact that it's all about the processes. These are the arrows and diagrams and things like that. And these are just fundamental words that I'm going to use here. Now, there's another term I'm going to introduce called multiplicity. So the multiplicity of a given process, which I call omega, is just the number of possible outcomes that you have for a given process. Okay? So this is I should emphasize that right now I'm talking really at the micro level. So I gave an example of what I was doing, but I'm really talking at the micro level here. So for a given process, we have a certain number of possible outcomes, and it's equal, we'll call it n outcomes. And the multiplicity is just what that number is. And here's the thing. A process can be anything between completely random and completely deterministic. And I have Morrow to thank for this, for making this point clear. Determinism is different from causality, and here's why. Determinism, a deterministic outcome, or a deterministic process is one for which there is only one possible outcome. Right? You have one state, you have another outcome, and that's the only possible one. That's deterministic. A completely random process is one where you have multiple possible outcomes, and they are all equally probable. So their weights are all, and real processes are usually somewhere in between the two, right? They're somewhere in between the two. Even random processes can be causal because something causes something to happen. It just, the outcome may be random, but you can still have a causally random process, okay? But that's a side thing to this. But these things it's important to understand this difference between random and deterministic within this context. And I don't think this is new to anyone, but I just want to set the stage here. So, how do we get, so let me back up a second and say, because I'm a quantum physicist, I look at the world and I know that at the fundamental level, things are random, right? Stuff is random at that fundamental level. But I know my life isn't random, not completely. I can make determined choices, and I can choose something, and I know that I can have that outcome. How is that possible if I have an underlying randomness to the universe? And it works out fairly easily. It's actually a standard thing in statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. The thermodynamic limit is essentially this very concept. So within this model I'm developing, though, if we consider a macro system, so now we're talking about something like me or something like that, that's composed of n, and this, by the way, I'm just giving an example. This is a completely artificial example of a system made up of a bunch of two-state systems, just to show you that you can get a deterministic outcome from underlying randomness. So suppose you have we have a macro system that has n non-interacting two-state microsystems. So it's some two-state system. It could be a coin, fair coin. It could be a particle that has spin up and spin down, whatever. It's got something like this. And we can ask how many subsystems will be in the state j equals 2 after this macro process occurs. Notice I've capitalized pi because I'm now talking about a macro process. And the answer is just given by the multiplicity, which is this is sort of, again, standard statistical mechanics. You look in any statistical mechanics textbook, you'll find this in like chapter 2. And you get this nice equation. And what's really important about this equation is the plots associated with it. The probability distribution of which state will actually occur, if you start out, if n is very small, like n is equal to 10, you get this sort of broad probability distribution here. See, it's very broad. And as n increases, you see that the distribution gets narrower and narrower and narrower. So as n goes to infinity, the distribution tends toward a delta function. But the underlying systems are all completely random. all completely random, whether and they're not interacting. They're not even interacting. There's no interaction taking place here. And yet, you have a macro state that becomes overwhelmingly probable that you transition to. So the transition, as n gets larger and larger and larger, becomes more and more deterministic. So you can get deterministic outcomes from underlying random processes. And I'm building a whole process ontology about this, but after I talked to Bob Kuka, I decided I don't need to. He's already got one. So I'm going to see if I can make it work. But anyway, that is the motivation for this idea that our choices are deterministic processes, but there's still a randomness to the universe. Okay. So what is a choice then? What do I mean when I say I have a choice? Well, I refer to a choice in this model as some possible macro process that is simply a means by which a system can transition from some fixed macro state to one and only one possible other macro states. So it's like a process. It's just a macro process, essentially. So for now, that's just what I'm going to call a choice. All right? Now, when I say a choice, one of the things I want to emphasize is let's go back to the refrigerator. I have carrots and peppers and pizza and beer. Each of those is an individual choice, right? So I'm presented with several possible choices, and then when I choose, I'm making a choice, right? So it's not like the act. This is very important. The act of choosing carrots is completely different from the act of choosing pizza, right? They're not located in the same place in the refrigerator. One is over here, one's over here. If I reach for the carrots, I reach for the pizza. Those are completely different processes. Completely different processes. So it's important to remember that. So, and each of them is an individual choice. Okay. Choices fall into two categories, and I acknowledge George Ellis for hounding me for almost a decade about this. If anyone is familiar with George Ellis's work, lately he's been very much interested in top-down causation or downwardly. He now prefers downwardly causal and upwardly causal because he's not convinced there's a top and bottom layer. And he keeps pestering me about it. And this summer he finally convinced me that I finally got what he was trying to say. So I'm going to call my two categories of choice adaptive or instinctual. So an adaptive choice is influenced by downwardly causal processes, okay? So downwardly causal would be contextual, environmental kinds of things. Downward forcing. So you have a process that builds up, but then something emerges, and there's an emergent system, and it forces a downward, it's a causally downward thing. So the emergent behavior has a causal effect on the behavior that's several levels below that. Okay? Instinctual choices are influenced by upwardly causal effects. So they're the types of choices that just build up from the bottom up. Okay? So they just evolve naturally from a bottom-up standpoint. So those are the two types of choices that I want to emphasize are there. So certainly we make some choices in our lives that are instinctual. We make some that are adaptive. And what we think of as free will, I'm associating with adaptive choice. Okay. And I call the total number of choices that's presented to the system at a given time, I'm calling it my choice ensemble. Okay, so in addition to these definitions, my model's built on the following. I've got a bunch of axioms here that really just follow from my arguments that I talked about before with the carrots and stuff. So the first thing I assume is that the most fundamental systems are irreducible to other systems. So they contain no interactions, they can't be partitioned, whatever. And I assume that all possible configurations, meaning the microstates of the fundamental systems, are equally likely in the long run. So because I'm building up these states, to these deterministic probability distributions for my choices, okay? And a system's macro states are formed from interacting microprocesses. So I've got lots of little interacting microprocesses going on, and that's what gives the macro state, which is me or the table or whatever. But we're really talking about me because tables don't have free will, one would assume. The probability that a choice will lead to its expected macro state is arbitrarily high if the choice is free. We talked about that. I rely on the fact that the carrot doesn't turn into a potato before I eat it. And the number of possible choices that a system has to be small enough to be read into the system's memory in a finite amount of time. Okay? Talked about that earlier too. And then here's another one that's important. The choices don't change generally. This is a slightly loose one. Choices generally don't change prior to, this should say actually after, not prior. This should say after the decision of the agent, right? So if I make my choice, if I'm presented with carrots, peppers, pizza, and potatoes, if I then make my choice, I don't suddenly, whoa, there's a chocolate bar. Oh, crap, I want that chocolate bar, right? That doesn't happen often. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't happen often, right? For the most part, we rely on the fact that when we're given an ensemble of choices, that ensemble remains roughly constant during the process with which we choose and then actually take the action, and relying on that to occur that way. And here's a crucial piece. The choices must be sufficiently distinct. If I have a refrigerator full of completely 100% identical carrots, and I'm not talking like no two carrots are the same in reality, but if I had a refrigerator that had nothing but identical carrots, why bother making a choice? They're all exactly the same. Doesn't really matter, right? Sometimes my wife gets really irritated with me when I go shopping, especially for books. And if there's multiple books on the shelf, I'll pull them out and I'll look at them, make sure there aren't any bends in the paper and all that stuff. And she's like, they're all the same, just grab one, right? But they're not all the same. 5 minutes? Okay. Oh, crap, really? All right, well, I'm going to go into my question time because all right, so here's the model. So suppose that we have some macro system composed of k microsystems that's presented with an ensemble of n possible choices for which each choice in the ensemble has a certain number of outcomes, okay? The probability distributions associated with those choices in the ensemble are that, where E and K are just the mean and variance for the given distributions. So the choice ensemble is defined as a mixed distribution, okay, where they have the weights, and it's a convex function, all right? And so the weights are where the real interesting stuff happens, okay? Now, how do we analyze? We're interested in analyzing this choice ensemble. That's what the idea of free will, that in order to analyze free will, we want to analyze this. How can we do that? Well, first of all, you can locate the relative location of the peaks. You can use this ridgeline function, which I'm just going to skip over. It's not that important right here. What really is important is in order to capture the distinctness axiom, we can use something called the Mahalanobis distance between any pair of constituent distributions in the mixed distribution, which is given by this. And this is K is the covariant matrix here, so that's not actually a single covariance, it's a covariance matrix. And this is preserved under full rank linear transformations of the space that's spanned by the data comprising the distribution. So this is our measure of distinctness. The time required, and I don't know exactly the form of this yet, but the time required for the system to read in and process the choice ensemble is going to be some function like this, where T min is some minimum time below which any choice is considered instinctual and not adaptive, okay? And the dependence of this time on on this, which is the ridgeline function, is indicative of the fact that different topologies may be more difficult for the system to parse than others, right? So it may be harder, you may have to take longer to process choosing between different things if the things are not very distinct, or if they have some kind of, if for some other reason they don't present a unique enough distinction to you. So the time that you spend depends on that. So if I define a free choice as follows, if given a number of possible choices n from an ensemble, the freedom of choice I is given by this function, which I'm calling zeta. And a friend of mine said, "You called it the zeta function. Why?" And I make it, it's proportional to, because one of the open questions is what is the exact form of this. But it's proportional to the inverse of the covariance matrix. Why the inverse, and actually that should not be the matrix. That should be the inverse of the covariance, so that should not be bold. The inverse of the covariance for the ith choice. And why is the inverse? Because I expect that to be the higher the freedom, the more narrow the distribution, right? So it should be inversely proportional. Then you've got this time function mixed in there. I don't know exactly what the dependence on this time function is yet. And then you've also got the minimum Mahalanobis distance. So we expect, given a bunch of choices, the freedom is going to be a measure of how close it is to its closest partner, right? So I could be given a choice between 2 carrots and a pizza, and if the 2 carrots aren't quite alike, and then the pizza is very different, that changes the freedom of my choice somehow, because I have 2 things that are very similar. Free will then is given by a partition function, and I won't have time to explain my choice of a partition function for this at the moment. But I just wanted to mention that this is what I'm using as a measure of free will. The key to this is that what I'm proposing is a measure of freedom of choice and a measure of free will. Now, clearly, I haven't given you an exact number or anything like that. I've given you nothing that you can calculate yet. This is in the very latent stages here. So it's kind of research in progress. But I do want to say one thing or a couple things quickly about the weights. The weights in the choice determine whether the action is entirely random, if the weights are all equal, or entirely deterministic if there's only one constituent distribution, or something in between. And freedom is a spectrum between the two. And the distinction between adaptive and instinctual choices lies in the choice of the weights in the choice ensemble. Okay? So how the weights are assigned tells us whether it's an adaptive or instinctual choice. And so sometimes we assign the weights, and sometimes the weights are assigned for us. Adaptive choice is downwardly causal, while instinctual is upwardly causal. And memory, this is another point that someone made. I think my wife actually made this point. Memory is a very key component of informed choice. It's necessarily a downwardly causal process, and so it's a key component to an adaptive model of free will. All right, so some open questions. The biggest open question of the model is what is exactly the form of this zeta function? And can a zeta be found, a form can be found that is actually testable in the real world situations? And that is ultimately my goal. And I'm working toward that goal. How is the assignment of the weights in the choice ensemble accomplished? This is very important because it relates to this idea of the difference between an adaptive versus an instinctual model. And what's the full underlying process ontology for the microstate processes? Because this determines how these distributions arise and how do we get these narrow distributions. And actually, it would be interesting to see is, normally what I showed were all Gaussian distributions. Well, maybe you can get some other types of distributions out of thinking differently about the underlying processes. And then does the model necessitate a dualist or panpsychist view? I have a tendency to think it might, but I don't know. We'll see. Maybe you'll have. And is it compatible with any existing models of consciousness? So I've talked to a lot of IIT people about this, and I'm actually interested in trying to tie this to IIT. So last, I'm just going to thank some people, Robert, for pushing me on some of these things, and George Ellis and Carlo Rovelli and my son for some important points, and there are some others. So thank you.